So the first discussion point we have for you out of three is, should there be any control on freedom of speech? What do you guys think about that? Kausar, if I can start with you.
I think it's very important to understand that Islam always talks about a balance. So there's never one way or the other. There's moderacy. So if we're going to talk about this from the get go, we should know that Islam is going to have a balance between the two. Whether there should be a little bit of censorship, or
Hmm.
there should be freedom of speech, and where's that line that we draw?
Yeah, I think a lot of the people who like hear that, the first thing, people who are really sensitive about free speech, they might think that that's how you're going to tell me that you're going to censor me. But I think there it's important to point out a nuance, which is that even here in the Western world, there is different degrees of free speech. Even for example, in France, in Germany, and other parts of Europe, you can get arrested for something that we consider an inalienable right to freedom of speech. So that point
Yeah,
you mentioned on moderation, I mean, definitely, like, there is
I
some
think
censorship that needs to be done.
yeah, I think it also comes down to cultures and which country you're in. You can be in one country and saying something can be very, problematic, and in another place it may not be very problematic. But the whole question of even freedom of speech, does it mean to say whatever it is that you want? I think that's the first question that comes to my mind, at least. Does it mean I can just say whatever I want without thinking of consequences or even effects?
The way I understand it is that you can say whatever you want as long as it's not causing real world harm. Because when I look at the teachings of the Holy Quran, we see that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was taught to tolerate blasphemy. People were making fun of his religion, God, even to the point of his family, his wives, personal things, like the most offensive thing you can think of. But if
Yeah.
it was not causing real harm, like, facade, disorder, like violence in society, then the Quran says that just bear it patiently, leave them when they
Hmm.
talk about stuff like that,
Yeah.
talk, convey to them the message of peace some other time. So that kind of shows me that yes, you can say whatever you want, but the judgment is not on is it too crazy, is it too offensive, but it's on what is it causing damage to society.
It's also the line, right? Where do we draw the line, and when is it offensive? And because it's it can also mean that it may not be violent, but somebody can just
Right.
be sensitive towards something that someone says, right? That's also
No, I
another
think that's
angle.
why. Yeah, I was actually gonna ask Rizwan to clarify a little bit more, because really, what does harm mean, right? Is it physical abuse?
Yeah.
Is it just sensitivity? What is it? Where is that line that's drawn? I think it's important to understand too.
Yeah, I think, like, for example, in our own, I like to give Europe as an example because they have faced very serious situations. They faced a situation where a use of freedom of speech against the Jewish people resulted in a Holocaust. So now, based on that, they don't tolerate anti-Semitic language. All this stuff they talk about, cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, that's our free speech. You make an anti-Semitic cartoon about people who follow the religion of Judaism, they're not going to tolerate that. They're going to get in serious trouble for that. So when a society
Yeah.
has experienced that, okay, this kind of speech can lead to real violence, then you start connecting those dots. So I think that's how
Yeah.
you draw the line
That's
intuitively.
an interesting point, to say that we're not going to wait for the violence to happen. If it can lead to violence, or history has shown us that something like this, that's a wise point. Something like this has happened, and it's our experience that it has led to religious persecution. If, let's say, it's happening to a political party, and we see the same blogs being created, then we should be careful. I think that's a really beautiful point that you raised there.
Yeah,
I
the
like that.
Quran speaks about the facade, for example, creating chaos and disorder in a society. That's the limitation. That's where you have to step in and make some changes. And I think we're seeing
Hmm.
that even around us in America today, when we see facade, when we see real violence, and that's the
Hmm.
point when we have to get up and actually talk about some of these things.
But
Yeah.
for those,
I
what
mean,
about those who think that, no, no, just let me say whatever it is that I want? They don't want to take responsibility for their words. Some people think I say what I think and what I feel is right. Somebody else takes that and interprets it their own way, and then they go and pounce on someone and cause violence. That person should be held responsible. Why should I be held responsible for what I believe in? It makes it a
yeah,
little critical, right?
Yeah, there from the Islamic perspective, there definitely is that point. At some point, it has to cross a line into facade. Now, when we put it into practical application, there's like a very recent example of hate against Asian Americans. Now, the question is, where do you go too far? Because firstly, you start off by calling it like the China virus. Now, Asian people start feeling kind of uncomfortable in our society.
Yeah.
Then the hatred gets a little bit higher. Now, a couple people start getting killed here and there. Now it's getting a little bit serious. So there's a certain point where we have to decide that, okay, just because of a lone wolf person, we're not going to just ban all speech against Asian people. But at a certain point, it gets to a point where now, yes, this speech is actually raising hatred against Asian Americans, and people are really becoming a victim of violence that is directly connected with this kind of language. So I think that connection has to be made, where government has a right to make that connection and say that we have a right to put a stop to that kind of language because it's causing real problems.
The other thing I was thinking of was that, it's one extreme, of course, is the facade, it's the chaos in a society, but the other one is allowing a free flow of information. What happens is when you have all kinds of nonsensical things that are, induced into society, then you can't actually decipher what is true, what is right, and what is wrong. And just to give a simple example, if I want to get from here to Manhattan or any place from A to B, there's certain regulations on the way for me to get there safely and effectively. But if you remove them and have complete freedom, guess what? I will never get anywhere. There'll be a gridlock. Or if there's the other extreme where there's so many regulations where I can't even get there to begin with. So this is a balance.
I think, that's a good, even within the US, right? You talked about the Holocaust, in Europe or anywhere else, really, or even racism. You cannot call a black person a kind of name, right? Because you feel like that's the best way of describing him or her. Or an Asian person, you can't call them a certain name. Everybody agrees that just because the person emotionally doesn't like it, but it becomes a problem when it's not just applied across the board. I think that makes it a little bit, tough and difficult as well. But I think if anyone feels offended, or if there's potential violence against anyone, then it would have been easier for us to measure, to say, okay, maybe we just need to apply it across the board. But when there's hypocrisy and it applies to some groups and not to others, that's what causes a problem. Right? Some people felt that I'm being silenced and somebody else is not being silenced about something else. So
I think the point about just saying nonsensical things, I think it's perfectly fine if people have a right to say nonsensical things, but then where it starts causing harm, then that's where it becomes an issue. And an example I can think of is just this point, like within the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, the point of the death of Jesus. So for centuries, people believed that Jesus didn't die; he physically was raised to the sky, and that was a misconception. But it was a harmless historical misconception for most of history. But then when the Christians started coming in and using that point to say that this proves that Christianity is true because Jesus is God, now it became a problem. So I feel like that's an analogy. So if some conspiracy theorist has a bunch of crazy ideas like the earth being flat, whatever, that's fine. That's free speech. But then when he starts saying that, for example, vaccines are evil and the coronavirus, and now that's causing thousands of people to die. People are, that starts to cross into a gray area where now you're actually causing real harm to society, putting a burden on the public healthcare system and, all of these issues. So I think that's where it gets a little bit where, we have to ask ourselves that, is this a type of facade too? It's not really inciting violence, but I think that is an interest.
Yeah, and even if we change the wordings a little bit, right, we say freedom of expression. Just because I'm a black belt in martial arts and I have my sword, doesn't mean I can go around just swinging it. If it happens to touch someone, I'm just expressing my skills. If you take it from words to physical, then it translates into something completely different. But people don't want to take, responsibility. For example, Donald Trump felt that he was cheated in the elections. And, they tried to hold him accountable, but they couldn't prove it. He felt that he was just saying what he thinks he got cheated on, and some other people went and took that out of, but he was like, no, I didn't tell him to go and do it. So it is really a fine line, right? But I think to an extent, everyone can agree that there should be some level of censorship. So let's go
before you head back into your busy lives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon.
Love for all, hatred for none.